So tonight I am going to talk about, I'm going to use anyway, this one of my favorite old Zen stories. Oops, I just got clicked off. As a kind of foundation for talking about the question that feels like I hear over and over, which is, given the state of things, what should I do? And the story is about a student who comes to visit his teacher, and the teacher is dying. He's on his deathbed. And the student says, "Tell me, what is the teaching of your entire lifetime?" I invite you just to pause for a moment and consider. You may not be dying, although actually we're all dying, right? Some of us more slowly than others. If someone were going to ask you, like, what's the essence of what you feel is really most important, what would you say? So that's what this student is asking his beloved teacher. What is the teaching of your entire lifetime? And I always imagine, you might say vast emptiness, or tremendous love, or being present every moment, or something like that. But he doesn't say any of those things. He says an appropriate response. So maybe you don't find this, it may just be the role that I'm in, but I have heard a lot of people wanting to know, how do we respond to the kind of fire hose of change and just, I want to say demo, kind of a demolition at a sort of political level, as well as all kinds of other crises. We have floods and fires and landslides and what are we to do? So I want to say right away that I don't have an answer. There is no Buddhist guidebook that you can, for this crisis, turn to page 93 and you'll get the answer, because that's not how the practice works. The practice really isn't about giving me or you answers, and it certainly isn't about telling any of us what to do. However, I do feel very deeply, especially now in this time and frame of so much churn and upheaval, that these teachings offer principles, perspectives, and practices that can help each of us find our own response. And important to say that there's no one right thing, right? It actually takes all of us. And in fact, because there's so many different things going on, it's helpful to know, and you could just take a peek on the screen for a moment to know that whatever your piece is, that there are other people doing their pieces too. Right? We don't all have to be doing the same thing. That we can trust that we'll do our part and others will do theirs as well. And it's important, I think, from the story to understand that this appropriate response, it's a lifetime's work. And you might hear that to say, oh, I have to do a whole lifetime of practice until I can find a good response, an appropriate response. But that's not really what I mean. What I mean by that is to say it's a lifetime of practice, is we're responding all the time. And we don't have to get it perfect, and we don't have to get it right. We just keep doing our best. And that's what it means. What is the teaching of your entire lifetime? It's to recognize that our whole lifetime is the teaching, and that everything that we do becomes grist for the mill. So we do our best, and we get some feedback, and we try again, and we keep going in that way. We are in a world in which it feels to me that, I'm going to use a word that maybe I shouldn't, but a true spiritual understanding, teaching, depth, is not really the way that most things are running, right? We live in a culture that is, capitalist. We live in a world in which power over and accumulation and wealth and efficiency, that's a big word these days. Efficiency seems to be the most important thing. And I will promise you that in spiritual life, efficiency is not the most important thing. This is a sidebar, but I remember years ago I saw this amazing movie, which I'm sorry that I don't remember the name of, but it was a story about these cloistered monks, Christian monks. And the preamble to the story was that this filmmaker had sent them a letter asking if he could come to their monastery and, film them and sort of show their life. And it took them, I think it was 12 years before they got back to him. And they wrote back and said, we had to think about it for a while. And then they said yes. And he came in and made this beautiful, movie that sort of gives you the feeling of that life. Anyway, that's spiritual efficiency. It's a different way of functioning, right? So in a spiritual context, maybe the most important thing is that we recognize the preciousness. And I might even use the word, integrate silence. Thank you, Claire. That's the film from 2005. You must have seen it too. It's really something. So we recognize the preciousness and the holiness of certainly of other human beings, right? That human beings aren't just cogs in order to be efficient, in order to get stuff done. That we recognize the beauty, the holiness of all of us. And when we move in the world from that perspective, how we behave is quite different than if we behave as if, somebody's getting in our way to get what we want. Some of you are old enough to remember the Allen Ginsberg poem, Holy, 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 Holy. Everything is holy. Everything is holy. That's the attitude. Not this is good and that's bad, or these people are better and these people are worse. And certainly no semblance of humans as dispensable. Right? And the same is true not just of humans, but of everything. Of the planet itself. Herself. There's this great phrase some of you have probably heard me say before from Zen. They say, in all the world, there's no place to spit. Because all ground is hallowed ground. There's nothing we throw away. There's nothing we discard when we are awake. So that's one. The other piece is what I was pointing to earlier, which is that from a spiritual perspective, because we recognize the depth, the truth of our deep connectedness, we can avoid feeling overwhelmed. And overwhelm is a big issue right now because there's this fire hose of activity and crises one after another. And it's hard to tell even which is real. Where should I put my attention? What's just distraction, right? But what we can do is remember what's important to us, remember what we care about. And I love this phrase from Suzuki Roshi, who's the founder of San Francisco Zen Center. He said, "You don't have to fix the whole world. You just shine one corner." It's a beautiful image. You just shine your corner. And maybe your corner is right now just you, but maybe it's also the people around you, or your neighbors, or your students, or your kids, or whoever else it is. But what would it be like if you really took that up? That your corner, your neighborhood, your circle of influence was a place that you could care for. And again, when we recognize that we're caring for ours and we know that everybody else here is caring for theirs, it helps prevent that kind of burnout. Because it's so easy to feel overwhelmed, right? Especially with the way the media and social media works now. It's just a bombardment, right? Constant, constant. And the last piece I will say is that really this, what I'm calling a kind of spiritual orientation, it's really, really a radical reorientation. That's what spiritual life is. It's definitely a shift from, efficiency and productivity and, fame and gain to simplicity, presence, tenderness, care. It's also a shift from, it's another way to say it, a kind of simple way, sort of from moving across the surfaces of our life, right? We move across the surface, like if you're on water and you get in a boat, you want to get across the water as fast as you can, right? To get to something. But a spiritual perspective shifts from horizontal to vertical. And it really invites us to drop into the bottomless moment, Or if you are in a body of water, it invites you to look down, to see the whole world of what's under the surface. It's the invitation to explore, not just skimming across the surface. And it's from that drop, from that depth, that kind of vertical descent, that we find it's not exactly solid ground, but we find something that we can extend out of. There's a kind of rooting that can happen that gives us a sense of stability, of place, of confidence. Otherwise, we're like the image of like tumbleweed. In the desert, you see tumbleweed is just kind of tumbling across the top. Doesn't have any, right? Any solidity. So this radical reorientation, I think it's worth naming what our usual orientation is. And I've been naming it with big words like, capitalism and efficiency. But one of the simple ways to talk about it, which echoes the story, is that we're shifting from reactivity to responsibility. We're shifting from a kind of knee-jerk habit to more of intentional, thoughtful, heartful response. So reactivity is what happens when we are not mindful. It's sort of very simple. In the Buddhist Abhidhamma, in the Buddhist psychology, we would say that every moment we are being bombarded by pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral stimuli. Some of it's internal, some of it's external. What that means is we have a negative thought, or we have a pleasant emotion, that's internal. Or we see a person who we like, pleasant. We have a smell of something we don't like, unpleasant. This is at its sort of very molecular almost building blocks of experience. So moment by moment, we are being flooded with pleasant and unpleasant, if we keep it simple, experience. And basically, it creates this reverb for us. It goes like this: pleasant, I like it, I want it, I grasp it. Unpleasant, I don't like it, I don't want it, I push away. And that grasping and aversion is what creates a kind of reverb in our system. Boom, 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 boom. So this is where we catch on pretty much as soon as we start meditating, we catch on that we're not in charge, right? We start to see that like we want things to be quiet, but actually there's all this churn. We're not in charge of that. But we can also begin to see our patterning and how moment by moment we're chasing after pleasant, grasping after pleasant, and moment by moment we're tightening, rejecting, trying to get rid of unpleasant. And when we see that at a very refined level, we feel it in our system. Always we're doing this. And this is the opposite of, what the Buddhist path offers, which we say freedom. So freedom means we don't have to be in reactivity. That through mindfulness, I often say, mindfulness begets choicefulness. That we don't have to do the same old, right? But we also, I just completely lost what I was going to say. It'll come back. Let's see. Mindfulness, choice, but there was something else. Does anyone know what I was going to say? Okay, I'm going to have to drop it. Oh, yes, the reverb. So one part of what the path promises is freedom, which is the freedom to choose, right? To not be caught in that habitual cycle. The other part of what the path practices is peace. Peace. Peace is the absence of that reverb. The word nibbana is sometimes translated as peace. It literally means to blow out. To blow out doesn't mean to die. To blow out means that that heat, that grasping and aversion goes quiet. And it's out of that choicefulness, out of that peacefulness, that we can begin to respond in ways that are not habitual. So as we practice, we start to see all of this. We start to see at a moment-to-moment level how it is that we are leaning into, grasping onto, wanting pleasant, and how we're leaning away from, not wanting, judging, avoiding unpleasant. And if we stay with that for a while, we also begin to see beyond just the moment to moment, pleasant and unpleasant, we start to see our patterns of reactivity. You know what I mean? We all have them, right? We start to see that how we're responding, and by that I mean reacting to the world, is not just a free and spontaneous response. It's completely conditioned by whatever your history is. History as in your past experience. And so we get into these grooves and we think, well, that's just the way it is, right? That's how I know how to respond. And part of the practice is to begin to see those patterns and to invite the possibility that it doesn't have to be that way. Some of you know one of my favorite stories from the story of the life of the Buddha lexicon is this moment when the Buddha is starving himself in his effort to awaken, because that's kind of the history. Those are the conditions. Like that's basically what everybody is doing to wake up at the time of the Buddha. There's this extreme asceticism that's being practiced. So he does what everybody else is doing, and he does this practice. And he takes himself almost to the brink of death. And then, and this is the key, he has this little question that bubbles up in him. Might there be another way? Might there be another way? This is for all of us. As we begin to see our own patterns of reactivity, we can bring a quality of curiosity, not judgment. We all have patterns of reactivity, and it's not that helpful to judge them. What's helpful is to see them clearly, and then to bring this spirit of curiosity, of inquiry, of investigation. Might there be another way? And you don't have to go figuring out what the other way is. Just ask the question and see what bubbles up. And that's what happened for the Buddha, who wasn't yet the Buddha. He had this memory come when he asked the question. I'm sure that's not what he was expecting, And he had a memory of a time when he sort of easily fell into a state of deep concentration as a young boy. But it was a state of ease, of contentment, of some degree of bliss. And he realized, oh, I don't have to be afraid of enjoyment. I don't have to be afraid of pleasure. I just have to not hold on. It's different. Yeah. So these are the practices that allow us all to begin to move from reactivity to response ability. And one of the things that we see as we start to see into our patterns of reactivity is that generally there's some tangle of ideas, beliefs, and assumptions that we have about who we are, about who other people are, about how the world is, that are keeping those patterns in place. So part of the inquiry and investigation, when we start to see our patterns, instead of slapping ourselves on the wrist saying bad pattern, we say, what is it? What's keeping this in place? What ideas do I have, right? So the Buddha thought that this starving himself was the way to practice. And it made sense because that's what everybody else thought too. But he was willing to ask, maybe there's a different way. And he challenged his own assumption. And he went and took nourishment, which was anathema at the time, right? But he chose to do that. He chose to do something different. And that's what becomes possible for us. As we challenge those beliefs and assumptions, we begin to have new possibilities open. There's this great quote that, as I was preparing for this, I remembered from Einstein. And he said, the most important question facing humanity is whether or not we believe, is whether we believe, is the universe friendly or unfriendly? That's a belief or assumption. And I'm going to assume that probably all of us have a whole bunch of beliefs and assumptions, most of which we don't see. We just think they're true until maybe we bump up against somebody with a different one, right? And then all of a sudden we're like, ooh. So you can get a sense of if you believe that the universe is friendly, or if you are sure that the universe is unfriendly, that how you move around the world will be very different. Yeah. This is why it's important to look at. And again, the more famous, more commonly known quote from Einstein is that we can't solve the problems we have with the same thinking that brought us those problems. Right? So this is what spiritual life offers us. It's a different kind of thinking, a different way of engaging, a different perspective, this radical reorientation. And the fundamental reorientation in Buddhist teaching is from separation to understanding our deep connectedness, from me to we. The truth, sort of core breakthrough that the Buddha had on the night of his awakening of this teaching of, it's called dependent origination or paticca samuppada, the seeing this web of interconnection. Or, as Buckminster Fuller said it very simply, I seem to be a verb. Right? The Buddha saw that who we are and who other people are and what the world is not a bunch of objects bumping into one another. That is not how it works. What's happening is this river of life. So if we look out in the world today at a lot of the suffering, it's coming from this. It's coming from a view, it's coming up from a perspective of a very deeply embedded sense of self and other, which creates, of course, what we would call otherizing. You know, otherizing? It's making people or making objects or making places or making cultures, especially that aren't like our own, into something threatening, unfriendly. And then how do we behave? Well, we see it all around us, don't we? So this is the third quote from Einstein, who answers his own questions. And he says, our task is to free ourselves from the illusion of separateness. The illusion of separateness, by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature. So when we let go of holding on to the belief of self and other as objects bumping into one another, when we let go of the belief that the world is a terrifying place that we need to protect ourselves from, then we start to have different choices. We start to behave in new ways. We begin to be able to respond rather than react. So I've been thinking about this 3-step process for what allows us to move toward an appropriate response. And this is a map I made up, so you won't find it in any sutta anywhere. But it goes like this. First, we need inspiration. Out of inspiration, we create aspiration. And out of aspiration, we are able to increasingly respond more and more appropriately. So inspiration is what we take in. Literally, we inspire, right? It's the breath that keeps us alive. And it seems to me so important, especially in a world in which good deeds rarely get good press, right? That we look for, that we remind ourselves of, that we stay inspired. Both from, literally taking in the beauty of the natural world, that can be a place, or taking in the delight of a pet or a child, or that's often an easy place. We can also look around at who inspires us. Who are those people? Who can we call on who have also been through very difficult times and have come out not reactive, not afraid? We need those stories of inspiration so deeply now. So someone like the Dalai Lama, of course, who had to flee his country and lived in exile, and who says, "My religion is simple. My religion is kindness." Wow. Now that might feel like a big stretch. I don't know. Or someone like Desmond Tutu, right? Who also lived through enormously difficult political, social, cultural breakdown. And because he was a deeply spiritual, deeply religious person, he, like the Buddhist teaching of interconnection, in his language, this was called Ubuntu. I am because we are. And he has this beautiful quote. He says, "A person is a person because they recognize others as persons." What makes us, what brings us a sense of humanity is our recognition of the humanity in everyone. This is the opposite again of having people be dispensable, imagining we could just wipe out, get rid of, not care about. How we treat each other matters. This is absolutely at the center of all spiritual life. Of course, there are spiritual traditions and practices that go way awry. We know that. But the teachings themselves across tradition, right? Many of you know or will recall the, what's her name? Bishop Budd, Budde. I don't remember how you pronounce her name, who was one of the few people who said, "Please Show people mercy, please. It's a courageous thing to do in this moment. And of course, the Pope did the same, right? So you feel this thread of this spiritual life, of spiritual teaching, and how, from my perspective, how absolutely essential it is for us to meet what we're meeting now, because this is an old story, my friends. And I, at least in my lifetime, I've never been here before. But these patterns of not treating persons as persons, this has been going on a long, long time. And it will take us being inspired so that we can aspire. To aspire is to live, I think of it as live by dharma, not karma. It's to live by vow. It's to live intentionally, to clarify for ourselves what is important and then line ourselves up with that rather than running down all the rabbit holes. And there's probably space for that too. Just try not to do it too much. Right? So we begin with inspiration by taking in what's possible. And then we aspire. We draw our line in the sand for what matters to us. And again, that can be different for each person. But so important in the so we don't become tumbleweed, right? So we can sink some roots. And as we allow ourselves to be inspired, to take in nourishment, and then I think of it as an inhale and exhale to breathe out our aspiration, to have that inform all of our activity of body, speech, and mind, lined up as best we can, right? And remember, this is a teaching of a whole lifetime. You don't have to get it right tomorrow, right? You're going to do your best. And sometimes you're going to get burned out and realize, ooh, I need some inspiration. That's okay. And sometimes you're going to lose your vow. You're going to lose what matters. You're going to have to redo it. That's what a whole lifetime means. It's an ongoing process. This isn't a check the box, go on cruise control. That's what it means to stay alive. That's what it means to cultivate a spiritual life so that we can respond. Evening. This for me is a vision of what an appropriate response looks like, and it is it's kind of a prose poem by Naomi Shihab Nye, who many of you may know is a Palestinian American poet. It's called Gate A4, and she wrote it some time ago, but the resonance for what she talks about and now still holds. So you can just kind of cozy up and let these images, beautiful images she writes, flow through you. She says, wandering around the Albuquerque airport terminal, after learning that my flight had been delayed, I heard an announcement. If anyone in the vicinity of Gate A4 understands Arabic, please come to the gate immediately. Well, one pauses these days. Gate A4 was my gate, so I went there. An older woman in full traditional Palestinian embroidered dress, just like my grandma wore, was crumpled to the floor, wailing. Help, said the flight agent. Talk to her. What is her problem? We told her the flight was going to be late, and she did this. I stooped, put my arm around the woman, and spoke haltingly. The minute she heard my words, she knew, and she stopped crying. She thought the flight had been canceled entirely, and she needed to be in El Paso for medical treatment the next day. I said, no, we're fine. You'll get there, just a little later. And who's picking you up? Let's call him. So we called her son, and I told him I'd stay with his mother until we got on the plane and ride next to her. And then she talked to him, and then we called her other sons just for the fun of it. And then we called my dad, and she and he spoke for a while in Arabic and found out, of course, that they had 10 shared friends. And then I thought, just for the heck of it, why not call some Palestinian poets I know and let them chat with her? Well, all of this took 2 hours. She was laughing a lot by then, telling about her life, patting my knee, answering questions. She had pulled a sack of homemade mamoul cookies, little powdered sugar crumbly mounds stuffed with dates and nuts from her bag, and she was offering them to all the women at the gate. To my amazement, not a single woman declined one. It was like sacrament. The traveler from Argentina, the mom from California, the lovely woman from Laredo. We were all covered with the same powdered sugar and smiling. There is no better cookie. And then the airline broke out free apple juice from huge coolers, and 2 little girls from our flight ran around serving it, and they too were covered in powdered sugar. And I noticed my new best friend, by now we were holding hands, had a potted plant poking out of her bag. Some medicinal thing with furry green leaves. Such an old country tradition. Always carry a plant. Always stay rooted somewhere. And I looked around that gate of late and weary ones, and I thought, this is the world I want to live in. The shared world. Not a single person in that gate, once the crying and confusion stopped, seemed apprehensive about any other person. They all took the cookies. This can still happen anywhere. Not everything is lost. So with a deep bow of gratitude to Naomi for her beautiful words, it's called Gate A4 if you want to look it up. We bring our evening to a close and just feeling whatever's been touched in you or filled in you, and opening our hands, opening our hearts, sending it out. Freely, generously sharing any goodness, any benefit, any merit that may have come from our gathering together this evening in words and in silence. By the power and truth of our practice together, may we together with all beings be free from suffering. And may we, all of us, awaken and be free. Thank you, friends. I hope we'll see some of you next week, maybe in the flesh.